I told you last night about Bill, and tonight I also shared with you that I was going to talk about Jane, and so I'm going to talk about Jane today, because Jane was a very important person in my life. When I graduated from seminary at Andrews University, I had been working with Dwight Nelson and worshiping with Dwight Nelson, and when the time came for me to leave seminary, the Texas Conference didn't know where they were going to send me. Now, you got to think in your minds of the position that I was in. I was actually the president of the Seminary Student Forum, and that was a pretty prestigious role in my eyes. But in the eyes of the Texas Conference, it meant nothing. And it meant that when I was graduating, even though they had hired me and they had paid for my 2 years at Andrews University, they did not know where they were going to send me. And so they sent me to this little church of 9 people. I went from 2,000 people every single Sabbath listening to me sing and lead out in worship to going to Marietta, Texas, which had 9 people. And when I got to Marietta, Texas, it was such a small little town in eastern Texas that when they saw me, the members, youngest of whom was 58 years old, looked at me and said, "Pastor Johnson, you look too much like a Mexican. Somebody's going to shoot you. You can never go to visit any of our members by yourself." And I had to take a member of my church with me. And the head elder of that church was a Baptist gentleman who was a 32nd degree Shriner. And he was the head elder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It was a fascinating place to be. And a very interesting place because that church was in the white section of town, and half a kilometer outside of the white section of town was the black section of town. And never did the two meet unless they were actually doing business together. And so for me, as a brown person, I was darker at the time. With age, I've become more white like my mother. It was quite a challenging environment. How do we actually function? And I worked in that church for 1 year. And at the end of that year, the Texas Conference sent me down to Killeen, Texas, where the story of Bill was. Now, when I got to Killeen, Texas, the first sermon that I preached, at the end of the sermon, I went to the back of the church, and as I was shaking the hands of the church members, one of the church members came to me. Her name was Jane, and Jane must have been about 57 or 58 years of age, and she was one of these very well-dressed, well-coiffed, makeup in the right place, a Southern belle. And if you've ever seen the Southern belles in movies, they actually do exist. The hair is sprayed to the utmost degree, and the makeup is made so that it just adds flash to the eyes that they have. And Jane came up to me and she said, "Pastor, are you going to work when you're coming here as a pastor?" And I said, "What do you mean, Jane?" She said, "Most of our pastors, they pretend to work. Are you going to actually do some work?" And I thought, Lord have mercy, how in the world did they send me to this church? And Jane said, "If you want to work, Pastor, I'll be happy to work by your side." And I said, "What does that actually mean, Jane?" And she said, "Pastor, if you want to work, you just give me your entire week and I will control it and make sure that you actually do the job." And I thought, whew, that might be a little bit much. And so I said to her, "Jane, I'm happy to have a conversation next week when I'm in the office. Why don't you come in and we can talk about what you are thinking this work should look like?" And so on Monday morning, Jane showed up in my office. I was 28 years of age. I'm sitting there thinking that I knew everything that I need to know. I had a 2-year degree from Andrews University in a master's. I had a 4-year undergraduate degree with a minor in biblical languages. I knew how to run a board meeting. I knew how to do a Bible study. I knew how to actually take care of churches because I had run my own church and I'd been an associate in the church at Fort Worth, never mind the fact that I'd been working at Pioneer Memorial Church. And so there I was on Monday morning waiting for the great Jane to come and see me, and Jane started to tell me her story. She said, "Pastor Johnson, when I was a young lady, I was a Lutheran, and as a Lutheran, I decided that I wanted to become a Lutheran priest, and so I went to the Lutheran seminary in Virginia, and I learned what it meant to be a minister. But then I met Dale, and Dale is a Seventh-day Adventist dentist. I fell in love with Dale, and so I learned about what it meant to be a Seventh-day Adventist, and I joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church and put aside my dream of being a priest in the Lutheran Church." And she said, "I have gifts that God has given me that allow me to think about how the church can actually systematically grow. And I know that you as a young man have learned how to be a pastor. You've learned how to do the Bible studies. You can talk about the 28 fundamental beliefs and really share that well. You preach well. I heard that on Sabbath. But do you know how to actually get an entire church up and running and working in a systematic manner to share the good news with people who may be coming? And I said, well, Jane, I'm all ears now. Tell me what you think we need to do. She said, Pastor, the first thing that you need to do is you need to actually put me on the greeting team. And I said, Jane, we can't do that. The nominating committee has already met. They've already chosen the people that are supposed to be the greeters at the front door. She said, yes, Pastor, but they're all terrible. They don't know what they're doing. And she said, if you put me there, I will sort them out. And I thought, whew, this is going to be a challenge. And say, all right, what's your second thought? She said, well, if you allow me to do that, I guarantee that there will be a lot of people who will end up coming to church on a regular basis because God will actually make this a safe church landing spot for them. And I need you to step up and do the following. I said, all right, Jane, what is it that you want me to do? She said, first of all, I need you to start a Bible class called Christianity 101. And in that Bible class, every question will be allowed. There is no question that is disallowed. And over the course of 12 months, you're going to study the Bible with people who are going to be coming to this church because God is going to say that it's a safe place for them. I said, well, and what else do you want me to do, Jane? She said, well, you need to actually train 2 elders to run that Bible class. So on the Sabbaths that you can't be there, they can continue it. And in 12 months' time, when you've run through the course of all the questions that they can possibly ask, you can then split them off and actually start them as their own Sabbath school classes, and then you start another one. I said, okay. And she said, there's more. I said, all right. So the more is that every Sabbath, when I'm in charge of that greeting team, I'm going to introduce you to every single new person that comes to church. You are going to come and say hello to them. I said, all right. And then on Monday morning, you and I are going to write a letter to every single one of them. And then on Wednesday of that next week, I'm going to call them and I'm going to ask them when they can be available to see you in their home. I said, well, how's that going to work? She said, leave that to me, honey child. Everything's going to be fine. I said, all right. So I made a decision, and it was a fateful decision in a good sense, that I actually said to the church board, we need to put Jane in charge of the greeting team. They need a little bit of sprucing up. And Jane jumped in on that, and she transformed the entire group. She got them thinking about the fact that as soon as somebody comes to church, the first impression that they have about church is what's happening in the car park. Is there somebody to make sure and tell them where to go? Because if people come to your church, they don't know where to go. They're feeling uncomfortable. They're not sure if you're a loving church. Because frankly, we are already classified as a cult or a sect. And so them coming onto the church property is a massive move. And so when they come onto the property, if somebody's greeting them at the front door and then sharing with them where they can go, that's step 1. Step 2, because Jane was such a friendly person and had that southern charm, when people would come into the front door, she would just come up and say, hi, my name is Jane. It is so good to have you here. What is your name? And they would just tell her, here's my name. Oh, fantastic. Where do you live? And she would get their addresses, and she would write them down, and then she'd stick them up against the wall like a mugshot and take their picture. Ka-ching! She'd get their email and their cell number, their mobile number, and then she would take them personally to my Sabbath school class and sit them in the Sabbath school class and introduce me to them and introduce them to all of the new people that were in the class. On Monday morning, we'd come together, and she would have a list of 10 people, because regularly we would have 10 or more new people attending church every single Sabbath. When your church becomes a place of safety, God then sends people to your church. These were people we had never met. Most of them were 18 and 19-year-old boys and girls who were in the military. and who were looking for a home. Some of them were Seventh-day Adventists, but the vast majority of them weren't. And as they came, she would get their names, and on Monday morning, we'd send them a letter. Jane is going to call you on Wednesday. It was so nice to meet you, Pastor Terry Johnson. On Wednesday evening, because it took 2 days for them to get the letter in their mailbox, she would call them and say, "Hi, it's Jane. We met on Saturday last week. I'm just calling because Pastor Johnson was so happy to meet you that he would like to come and see you in your home. Are you available Sunday at 6 p.m.? And they would say no. She said, "Oh, that's all right. How about Monday at 5? And she would keep going until they said yes. And when they had said yes, she would say to them, "Pastor Johnson is coming. He'll be with you for 90 minutes or so." And I would go and I would ask them a question. "So tell me, what's your name? Where are you from? Tell me about your family." And as we were having the conversation, we were building trust, and then I would invite them back to my Sabbath school class that I was teaching. And by the end of the first year that we had done this, we baptized 27 people without any evangelism whatsoever because of what she did. So Jane was amazing. And for 4 years, we actually did this. And we averaged 27 baptisms per year for those 4 years. And it's because of Jane that I am actually standing here today. Because it doesn't matter how well you may preach, if you don't have the administrative abilities to realize that God gives gifts to volunteers all through the church, and you as a minister need to work with those volunteers, and sometimes God actually has to tell the church member, "Go tell the pastor that he needs to work." Now please be gentle when you do this, because Jane was not gentle at all. She was blunt as. And when she was as blunt as she was, it was a challenge for me to actually humble myself and listen to what she had to say. But I'm so thankful that I did. And it's people like Jane, and you have them in every single one of your churches, who if you release to do ministry, are going to transform your church, just like the entrepreneurs that we were talking about yesterday, and Lydia, as you saw on the screens again this evening. And so that brings me to a story that we find in the book of 1 Corinthians and Acts. So first of all, I want to bring you to the book of Acts, chapter 18, and I want to share with you a little bit about the environment in which this story occurs, because the story itself is only 2 verses long. And so when we get to the story, you're going to see how important this individual was to Paul's ministry, and as a result, he probably was engaged in the same way as Jane was engaged in my ministry. And this is what we see in Acts chapter 18 and verse 18. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time, and then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. And before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow that he had taken. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us anything about what this vow was. We don't know if he had made some kind of a vow of chastity, but he wasn't married at the time, and so there was no understanding of what the vow was. Because it seems to be a Nazirite vow, which meant that he was supposed to allow his hair to grow for a significant period of time. But what maybe gives us an idea as to what was going on is that the Bible actually tells us a little bit earlier in verse 11 that Paul, when he got to Corinth, really was not wanting to be in Corinth. He wanted to be in Thessalonica. But because God actually spoke to him and said to him, "No, I want you to stay here. This is a safe city for you. Continue to preach boldly." The Bible actually tells us that Paul stayed in Corinth for 18 months. And it's the second longest time that he spent in any one city. The only other city that he spent slightly more time in was the city of Ephesus. And the reason that he spends a lot of time in Corinth is because Corinth is not exactly the greatest city on planet Earth. Corinth had actually been destroyed in the year 146 by the Romans. They had come through and had destroyed it completely. And for almost 100 years, no one lived in the Corinth area. And it's really quite amazing to think that nobody lived there, because Corinth is this incredible small space of land on an isthmus that is 6.4 kilometers wide, and there are 2 ports on the west and on the eastern side that make Corinth a major port. But when the Romans destroyed it in 146, it was Julius Caesar in the year 46 who decided to rebuild Corinth, and over a 2-year period of time rebuilt it, including all of the temples that the Greeks had had before. And so it's in this environment that Paul is brought to the town to share the good news of Jesus. Now, when we think about this particular city, which was about 80 years old by the time that Paul gets there, we have to recognize that the temples that were in that city were tremendously influencing of the population. There were 3 of them that were major. There was the temple of Apollo. There was the temple of the sea god. What's his name again? Poseidon. And Poseidon is the god of the sea and the god of the earthquakes. And that little peninsula, that little isthmus of Corinth, has a lot of earthquakes and, of course, is surrounded by sea. But the most important temple that was destroyed in the year 146 and then rebuilt in the year 46 was the temple of Aphrodite. And Aphrodite's temple, it is said, had 1,100 male and female prostitutes in order to ensure the wealth of the city. And when you read, there was a gentleman by the name of Calypsus who wrote this: the temple of Aphrodite was so rich that it owned more than 1,000 temple slaves, whom both men and women had dedicated to the goddess. And therefore it was also on account of these women and men that the city was crowded with people and grew rich. For instance, the ship captains would freely squander their money, and hence the proverb, "Not for every man is the voyage to Corinth." Now the summit has a small temple of Aphrodite, and below the summit is a spring. At any rate, we are told that people come there and that it's washed on all its sides and that it's a sacred hill, and it has an account of the multitude of courtesans who were sacred to Aphrodite, and outsiders resorted in great numbers and kept holiday, annual leave there. And the merchants and soldiers who went there squandered all of their money, so that the following proverb arose in reference to them: "Not for every man is the voyage to Corinth." And this is where Paul spends 18 very long months. I mean, he could have spent it in Philippi with Lydia. He could have spent it in any one of the 7 churches of Asia Minor, but for some reason, God felt that it was important that Paul actually spends 18 months in Corinth. It's the place that he actually writes the most letters to, and the longest letters. When you're reading the epistles of Paul, you have 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And when you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, they're not filled with the kind of lovey-dovey feelings that you get from Philippians and Ephesians. They are filled with theology because of the concern of the sexual immorality within the church that was going on, and how they were abusing the Lord's Supper. And yet he also shares with them the spiritual giftedness that is necessary for a church to work in unity. And so this was quite a fascinating place. And the more that we read about the church, the more interesting it actually becomes. Come with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 2. And notice what Paul says to these brothers and sisters in Corinth. We'll start with verse 1. "Now about spiritual gifts, brothers, I do not want you to be ignorant. You know that when you were pagans, somehow or other, you were influenced and led astray to mute idols. And therefore I tell you that no one who is speaking by the Spirit of God says Jesus be cursed," and so on. So this is a very interesting church, because the majority of the churches in the New Testament at that time, the ones that had been planted by Paul, by Silas, by Barnabas, were predominantly made up of Jewish men and women, not pagans. But in Corinth, the vast majority of the church membership was actually of pagan origin. And they were of such pagan origin that they did not have the basis of theology that the Jewish nation had. And it meant that that's the reason why Paul actually had to write more letters. And inside the 2 letters that we have, we know that Paul probably wrote 4 letters, but we don't have access to the 2 letters that have been destroyed over time. And these are the 2 letters that actually still exist. That church had problems. And come with me to chapter 1 and verse 26 of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26. And Paul starts off this letter. He says, brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many of you were influential by human standards. Not many of you were of noble birth. So it's clear that this was a group of people who were hard-working longshoremen, sailors, and probably some of the courtesans of the temple of Aphrodite. But Paul continues and he says, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. Just think about how that would have felt for the men and women who were hearing this for the first time from the pulpit on Sabbath morning. I know who I am, and God has chosen me because it's the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chooses the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God, that is our righteousness, our holiness, our redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let him who boasts, boast in the Lord. So this is the church of Corinth. And when we see the church of Corinth, as I read to you from Acts chapter 18, verse 18, it is Cenchreae in the eastern suburbs of Corinth, where he has his hair cut off, where the port is, that we actually have the woman at the center of our little story. So come with me to the book of Romans chapter 16 and verse 1. And in Romans chapter 16, verse 1, we learn about a woman named Phoebe. And Paul uses these words. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church in the port city on the eastern suburbs of Corinth called Cenchreae. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and to give her any help that she may need from you, for she has been a great help to many people, including me. 2 short verses, and the only time that we actually hear about this woman named Phoebe. And when we read this story, we realize that it's probably around the year 56, about 4 or 5 years after Paul has left Corinth. And as he is writing this letter to the Roman church, he starts off chapter 16 in the concluding section of his epistle to commend to them a woman. And as he commends to them, he starts by saying, I commend to you. And when you're looking at the Greek, the word for commend actually stands for support. And I introduce to you favorably this individual. And further to that, in the Greek, there is another word that is used that the English does not translate. For some reason, in every single one of the translations that we have available to us in English, we don't have this word used. And it's the word in Greek that is moreover. And so it is Paul who is trying to ensure that there is an emphasis on the fact that he wants the people in Rome to know that Phoebe is commended moreover. She has done such a great work for him that he wants them to know how important she is to his ministry. There's another Greek word that is used, which is called a prostatis. And the prostatis means that she was a woman who was over others in a spiritual sense. Not simply in the physical sense of a household, but in the spiritual sense. And it's the only time that that word prostatis is actually used in all of Scripture, and it's connected to her. And then it's combined with another word, and that is diakoness. Deaconess. And deaconess in the Greek is a minister, a shepherd, a servant of the king. And so she was a church leader who was over a number of individuals. And in that combination, Paul was saying to the Roman church, please see Phoebe, who is my emissary on my behalf. In other words, she is here as if I was here with you. And I can't be, but I'm sending her as the next best thing. Phoebe was like Jane. Phoebe, for some reason, over the 18 months that she worked with Aquila and Priscilla and Paul, had become indispensable to the way that Paul actually did ministry. To the point where when he writes this letter to Rome, he entrusts it to her and says, I want you to take this letter by ship all the way to Rome, and when you get to Rome, I know you don't know any of the members there, but this letter will actually be important not only for you, but for the church in Rome. And he didn't know it at the time, but the book of Romans is one of the most important books for all of Christians, particularly when it comes to the understanding of the plan of salvation. And he entrusts it to a woman named Phoebe. Her name means radiant. Can you imagine? And there's some conjecture that she was not just simply radiant in terms of her character and in terms of her presence when she walked into a room, but that there was potentially the fact that she was also a healer, a physician of some sort, an assistant to a doctor, and that it was through her ministry that Paul maintained his good health. So this woman is truly important to the New Testament church and truly important to Paul's ministry. Without Phoebe, Paul would not have been able to accomplish what he needed to accomplish in the Corinthian church, which ended up becoming an important center for the Christian faith for generations thereafter. And yet we only have 2 verses about her ministry. But those verses have Greek words which clearly outline how important she was to God's plan of salvation for us. And when I see Phoebe, I see Jane. Jane's 81 years old now. And I had a conversation with her last week. I get a little emotional because she's my friend. She's 81. She fell over and she hurt her face, and therefore she didn't want to come and see me because she's a Southern belle. And we were having a conversation via text. And even though she's 81, she's spry. And she said, Pastor Johnson, you should meet the minister of our church. You'd like him. He listens to me. She still has an impact on my ministry today. And when we were in New Zealand, she and her husband Dale actually came and visited Kimberly and I shortly before Dale passed away at the very young age of 72. Jane is like the embodiment of Phoebe. And in your church today, there are Phoebes all over the place. And why aren't we using them? Why aren't we using the men and women who God has gifted, has blessed, and invite them to step up and do ministry that we cannot do, and to see the joy that comes on their faces when they do? Every time that we baptize one of those 27 people that we had on a yearly basis, Jane was at the foundation of them coming to church and studying. She was the one who always made sure that when it came to the worship services, that it was an open worship service so that Seleucus' story of the 4 bikini-clad women in the hot tub could be shared in the church service. I got to tell you another story from that. We once had a lady named Gloria. And Gloria came to church and she believed that she was a messenger of God. And so every time that we had these free-for-all Sabbath mornings, she would stand up and say, "Church, God has given me a prophecy. And her husband used to sit by her side, and sometimes the prophecy was about him. God has shown me that my husband's having an affair. Woo! Oh, man. Well, Jane was important in allowing that kind of freedom to occur in the church service. And yes, there were times that it was incredibly embarrassing. And yes, there were times where we just said, Lord Jesus, please help them. You know, there were times like that. But the authenticity of the worship service, the authenticity of people who were hurting, willing to share what was going on in their lives, was so much more important and so much more meaningful. And it made the worship service far more spiritually intense, because we knew what people were going through, and we could pray specifically for them right then and there. And the church services became as if we were in the New Testament environment. And so when I think of Jane, and I think of Billy and Bill and Debbie and Graham Ure in New Zealand and other men and women that I've had the pleasure of working alongside in ministry with, I look around at you and I hear some of the stories that you shared with me, and I see men and women who are dedicated to the kingdom of God, who are wanting to be used, who are wanting to step up and step into where God has actually placed them for such a time as this. And all you're needing is to be released. Well, sometimes your pastor doesn't know that you've got that passion. Why don't you go and share it with him or her, and share with them exactly where you believe God is wanting you to move. They may not understand how to use you. That's okay. Continue to have the conversation, because you're going to be a blessing to their ministry, and you're going to be a blessing to the church in such a way that one day you may end up being the emissary of them, like Phoebe was an emissary. Don't sell yourself short, because God has gifted you with gifts that are so important that even though we are not wise in the way of the world, we are not born with nobility, we are not born with authority, God laughs at all of that, because He makes it foolishness, because He wants you to be able to stand and boast in the Lord because of what you've been able to do on behalf of the kingdom. You are indispensable. Never forget it.